Okay, yeah, I mean, first, thanks so much for having me present, Natalia, and to all the organisers. So the topic is, what are landscape approaches and where are they being implemented? And I think I just want to start from saying that this is based on, personal perspective and the perspective of our team at C4, and want to acknowledge that there's many ways of conceptualizing or interpreting landscape approaches, and this is really just one, but we have tried to draw on the broader literature, and I've tried to do that in this presentation. Sorry. So yeah, this is based on some work we did a few years ago where we tried to track the evolution of integrated landscape approaches as a concept. And this gives, a general idea of how the approach has evolved. So starting from the early 80s, you have these integrated rural development approaches. And much of the work at this point was influenced by the kind of conservation literature, ecosystem management, landscape ecology, and principles of island biogeography, which obviously came earlier. And the first recorded example we found of the term landscape approach was in 1983 by Reed Noss in bioscience. But again, very much emphasizing the conservation component. And then over the course of the next few decades, you had this kind of shift towards these more integrated, the conservation development projects. And then in the last decade, well, probably last 2 decades now, is this kind of integrated landscape approach, and we've put on the graph here that there's a number of different implementing organisations or institutions that are kind of embracing these integrated approaches. But while I've put integrated landscape approach here, a lot of these organisations are calling them something different. And again, importantly here, I've put 2013 was when CGIAR's paper, the 10 Principles for a Landscape Approach, came out in PNAS. And that work, I think, is highly influential for landscape approaches and has really helped our team in the way that we perceive landscape approaches and the way we've now tried to operationalize landscape approaches. But what I should also say here as well is that this concept obviously builds on a whole history of other work, and some of the principles for landscape approaches that CGIAR recognizes have also been in use for, maybe even a century, some of them, kind of the idea of multifunctional landscapes or the idea of adaptive management have been around for a long time, but the CGIAR paper really helped to bring these ideas together, I think, and also emphasize the need to incorporate the social dimension as well. But as I said, there's many different terms, and this has created some confusion. If I can get my slides to move ahead, I'm stuck. Just bear with me a second. I'll see if I can get my slides to move. Okay, I don't know what happened there, but yeah, so this has created a terminology confusion because all of these different organizations that are now working on essentially integrated landscape approaches are branding them differently. And whether that's because of a lack of knowledge of the term landscape approach, or they just choose to brand their own approach differently for marketing purposes, we don't really know why people are choosing different terms. But the LPFN, the Landscapes for People, Food and Nature Network, they did a study back in 2013, and they identified over 80 different terms which were all essentially synonyms for landscape approaches. So while terminology confusion is normally perceived to be using the same words but not speaking the same language, what we're seeing with landscape approaches actually is that we're using different terms, but we are essentially speaking the same language because all of these terms mean more or less the same thing. But we talked in our paper in 2015-16, I think, about the challenge that this creates for policymakers and practitioners, if we're not delivering a coherent message from the research, that could potentially impede policy traction and uptake of the approach as well. Although I'll reflect back on that further in the presentation as well. So what are integrated landscape approaches? And I've put a few things here that they've been called or that people in the literature refer to. So are they a new paradigm? Are they a response to failings of sectorial approaches? Are they just a reinvention of old ideas? Or are they refining previous approaches? And then you see more in the kind of restoration, the forest landscape restoration work, and also climate change. We're seeing a landscape approach being offered as a pathway for implementation to fulfill these commitments. Is it a strategy to reconcile conservation development? Is it an attempt to bridge scientific divides between the natural and social sciences and others? Is it a move towards more democratic landscape governance? Or is it a landscape performance tool to analyse trade-offs at the landscape scale? And I think at the bottom there, is it all of the above? And I think when I first started developing this slide earlier today, I had a load more examples of what a landscape approach is or what it attempts to do. And so while the CGIAR paper in 2013 and subsequent papers have acknowledged that there is no universal definition of what an integrated landscape approach is, I think we're starting to move towards an idea of what a landscape approach contains. And that's why within our team, what we tend to say is that integrated landscape approaches are more easily characterized than they are defined. Because there's so many different elements to incorporate, you can't really fit that into a nice single sentence definition. So these are the things that we try to remind ourselves when we're thinking of landscape approaches or implementing them. The main thing here is in the middle, the context is absolutely key for operationalizing landscape approaches. They have to be adaptable and you have to be willing to change to meet the local circumstances. And then on the left of the slide, kind of some of the components that encompass a landscape approach. You'll see some of them are repeated from the previous slide. And I think you are trying to bridge policy research practice gaps. You are trying to reconcile disciplinary divides, and these are ongoing challenges. And I'll also refer later to the issue of monitoring and evaluation. So I think that's obviously important for landscape approaches. And then the final point, that they are long-term initiatives and they need to be focused on process indicators. So they're not just short-term projects, and they're not also just constrained by long-term outcome indicators. So you need to be thinking more short-term process indicators to ensure you're on track, but not too wedded to one end goal, if you like, because they are obviously dynamic processes. And yeah, that brings in the need for the adaptive management. And then on the right of the screen, some of the things that a landscape approach might aim to be doing. Obviously, improve collective action capacity is important. Empowering local and marginalised stakeholders. I think particularly in the early days of landscape approaches, this was a real key aim of these initiatives. Establish rights and responsibilities. Try to identify emergent threats or respond to shocks. And that's again where the monitoring comes in. Try to improve landscape multifunctionality and try to enhance resilience. And obviously inform policy and try to inspire innovation by bringing stakeholders together and sharing their concerns, but also identifying where there is synergy across different stakeholder groups that might lead to better outcomes. So like I said, that's just one way to characterize a landscape approach. There was also a paper came out last year, a group led by Carmenta, and they created a typology for integrated landscape approaches. And they used a data set from Latin America and the Caribbean, looking at 104 different examples of landscape approaches. And what they found is there's different degrees of integration within these so-called integrated landscape approaches. So you can see A and B on the screen there, the agriculture and conservation oriented are far more kind of sectorial in their nature, but they have expanded those activities to try to become more integrated. And then the bottom ones, C and D, are the more integrated examples where they're really bringing together people from different sectors. And interestingly, what this research found was the more integrated the approach, the more likely it was to lead to improved outcomes. And I'll go back to that data set a little bit more as well later on. So having said all that and saying that they're more easy to characterize and define, and we should probably not stress too much about trying to find a definition, this slide is kind of going back to this idea that we need a definition because, well, for a start, every time we go to present landscape approach work, this question comes up: how do you define them? So people obviously are concerned with having a definition. And again, on the left of the screen with the bullet points, it goes into some of the reasons why a definition is important, or more importantly, why a lack of a definition can inhibit progress. So a lack of definition implies a lack of basic norms or rules to follow. It makes evaluation challenging, and so then you can't really determine whether these approaches are effective or not. And it can lead to poorly designed interventions or conceptually weak efforts to operationalize. And it can inhibit our ability to provide clear guidance, like I said before, for policymakers, private sector partners, or practitioners. And then on the right of the screen, I haven't actually finished this slide, I'll be honest, but this is kind of starting to work towards a definition. So we have a definition for landscape provided by the EC, the European Council, and they say a landscape is an area as perceived by people whose character is a result of action in an interaction of nature and human factors. And that definition has been quite widely embraced, I think. But for me, what's missing there is the political dimension, and also, like I said below, that the acknowledgement that landscapes are fuzzy concepts and they're not planning units, and they're seen in the eye of the beholder. And that kind of quote that they're seen in the eye of the beholder comes from research back in the 70s. And so we need to remember that they are perceived differently by different people, and obviously people have different objectives and needs that they need to be met by these approaches. So, you know, at that point, you think this kind of level of ambiguity that we currently have with the definition of a landscape approach is quite useful, because it enables us to amend the approach as we try to apply it to different contexts. So building on from this, we did some work a few years ago where we reviewed the theory of integrated landscape approaches. And in our paper in 2016, we identified some of the key barriers to implementing integrated landscape approaches. And I've just briefly summarized here and on the next slide what those barriers are. So one thing we considered then was that the ongoing development of the theory and the conceptualization and these terminology challenges and proliferation of terms is stimulating time lag. So until, we speculate that perhaps until we've clearly defined what we mean by a landscape approach, we're not going to see widespread uptake. But actually, I think since we published this paper in 2016, we've kind of been proven wrong, because the uptake is clearly happening. So that goes back to my original slide where I was saying that although we don't have an agreed definition, we kind of know what we're talking about now. And I think that's shown in the fact that there are so many landscape approaches being implemented. But another barrier is the fact that operating silos persist at all levels and scales. And by this we mean not just silos between natural and social sciences, but also silos at ministerial level. We don't have a minister for landscapes, so they're still operating in their silos at that level as well. And overcoming those barriers is obviously challenging. And then engaging multiple stakeholders is often seen as a box ticking exercise to satisfy project requirements. So, obviously a key component of these landscape approaches is about bringing these multiple stakeholders together in a space that they're able to share their concerns and air their grievances, and also negotiate how they would like their landscape to be managed and be governed going forward. But we don't really know if we're getting the right stakeholders in these forums, and I think there needs to be more research related to that. So yeah, there's a nice quote from an old C4 colleague who said that participation is obviously more important than engagement. So attendance is not a sufficient proxy for participation. Just the fact that you're having people turn up to these meetings is not enough if they're not able to voice their concerns, for example, or be involved in the design and the monitoring. And then finally, monitoring itself remains the least well-developed area of landscape approaches. And that's something that I know we and many others are continuing to work on. So the same review of the theoretical literature, we also identified some areas that need to be developed for implementation. So, and areas that we found that are key to making implementation work, if you like. So evaluating progress is fundamental, obviously, to determine where gains or losses are being made, and then you can bring in the adaptive nature of it afterwards. Hybrid governance structures seem to be more preferable. I think I've already said that the need to acknowledge contextualization and not subscribe to panaceas, so not say that it's just one landscape approach applied everywhere is going to be the answer. That's certainly not the case. There's going to be places where a landscape approach is going to work, and there's going to be places where it doesn't. And that same landscape approach is not going to look the same in different landscapes. It's going to have to be tailored to meet the local needs. We need inclusive participatory stakeholder negotiation. I think I've mentioned that in the previous slides. And we need to recognise dynamic processes and be able to account for perverse outcomes. So of course, these landscapes evolve, and the approaches that are fitted to them need to evolve as well. So then we move on to where landscape approaches are being implemented. So this was a review that our team also did in, we looked at pan-tropical landscape approaches, and we published this work in 2017, and we found quite a few landscape approaches being implemented across the tropics. You can obviously see on the screen the majority being in East Asia and Pacific, East Africa and Latin America and Caribbean. But there are a number of caveats, I guess, to this research. So while we found a total of 174 landscape approach initiatives, 150 of those were from the grey literature. So only 24 from the peer-reviewed scientific literature. And that created issues in terms of the data that was available, and perhaps the robustness, I guess, of the conclusions that a lot of these reports came to. So out of the 174 examples, we didn't find any of those landscape approaches showing to be a negative outcome, which, on the one hand, seems really encouraging that we have 174 positive examples of kind of win-wins or triple wins, but we're also aware that these approaches are not easy, and you're trying to manage a complex landscape with lots of different interacting components. And so the reality really is that you're not likely to achieve win-wins or triple wins. The more realistic outcome is that there's going to be trade-offs. And so this was kind of concerning that we have 174 positive examples, but what we couldn't find was the was the data to support these conclusions that they were basically meeting their objectives. And we found very few examples that showed robust data to support those conclusions. So I think that was kind of a key finding from this research, is that we need more honest reporting of landscape approach efforts. So while there's widespread implementation, we haven't got really the evidence of effectiveness so far. So then there's also another very important review that was conducted by the Landscapes People, Food and Nature Network. And they did a continental review of landscape approaches, so a larger scale than the C4 study. And they found 428 examples globally. They used different methods. So they weren't looking at the scientific literature. It was done by online survey. And you can see there was a good spread across each of the continents. And they found some consistency in terms of the domains. So the domains actually relate to the slide that I showed previously of the Carmenter et al. Study. So they found, a lot were focused on more conservation objectives, or more focused on agriculture interventions, or there were these more kind of integrated approaches. And they also found that across a lot of these approaches, there was weak engagement of the private sector, and in a lot of them as well, there was weak governance frameworks, so weak political support as well. But again, it kind of shows, this review, that there's no doubt that these landscape approaches are being widely carried out. Yeah, so that brings us to this idea of private sector engagement. And I think in both of the reviews I've mentioned, we found fairly limited engagement of the private sector. But having said that, there is kind of a lot more noise around private sector engagement in landscape approaches in recent years. And I think I've put on the screen there kind of some of the big multinational companies that are now claiming to be taking a landscape approach to their supply chains. And I think the reason for this greater engagement of the private sector, or the increased awareness, is kind of twofold. One is that I think from the conservation or the research, the environment perspective, there's kind of a clamour to engage the private sector, because they're trying to fill these funding gaps that are considered to, inhibit progress towards these large restoration or sustainability commitments, like the SDGs, the bond challenge, etc., etc. There's these huge funding gaps, and there's this perception that the private sector can help fill those gaps by sustainably financing these initiatives. And then I think there's also a motivation from the private sector, because they want to secure their supply chains, and they perhaps increasingly aware that they need to green their supply chains in order for that to happen. And perhaps there's increasing consumer pressure for more sustainable supply chain activities. But I think, we're probably going to see more engagement of private sector in landscape approaches, but I think, there has to be some caution there. I mean, certainly from my perspective, it seems that, a lot of these guys are kind of more typically associated with the problem in terms of landscape sustainability, rather than in terms of the solution. And certainly private sector activities are not really well aligned to landscape approach principles. So landscape approaches are concerned with long-term sustainability, whereas private sector are concerned with short-term profits. Landscape approaches are concerned with engaging multiple stakeholders and achieving collective action, whereas private sectors are more concerned with keeping shareholders happy. So, there's obviously some obvious tensions there between principles and traditional private sector actions. And I think that can also be linked to the commitments that the private sector have so far made to things like the New York Forest Declaration, where there was a lot of fanfare because the private sector was stepping up. But actually now, when you look at the monitoring of their activities, there's pretty poor performance so far, particularly from the beef and the soy sectors. And essentially their actions are not really living up to their kind of non-binding commitments, which is a concern. And then even where they are making their own commitments to other sustainability initiatives, it's often not long before some environmental watchdog organization kind of picks up on their actual activities and shows them to be lacking. But having said all that, we need to try to work, I guess, with the private sector and also just make sure we continue to apply pressure through good research and grassroots movements, I guess. So starting to wrap up. So some persistent challenges and lessons that can be learned from the research so far. So landscape approaches are often funded on short-term basis. They're often linked to projects. That's obviously a problem when we want to think of landscape approaches as long-term initiatives. The terminology confusion I think I've gone to at length already. There's still a lack of true integration across scientific disciplines. It's just really hard to get different scientific disciplines to work together in an integrated fashion, and not just the natural and social sciences, but you need to really be having people working on trade, people working on law, people working on behavioral psychology. There's so many elements that really need to be incorporated. But obviously doing that is challenging and of course requires money. So that's another challenge to overcome. There's still a lack of appropriate metrics. So monitoring is the least well-developed area. We still don't have a kind of gold standard for how to assess the performance of landscapes. There are some kind of emerging areas here. There's the land scale initiative, which the Rainforest Alliance is involved in. And I think that's one metric that might be useful. But as yet, there's nothing really that's kind of grabbed the collective attention and been applied to multiple landscapes. So again, that's an area that needs work. A lack of government support, like I said in the review done by LPFN, that was considered a major challenge. Government agencies are rooted in silos, so these are all kind of connected. And then governance concerns, a lack of empowerment given to rural communities. Again, I'll touch on that in the next slide. Yeah, and the peer-reviewed evidence base remains poorly developed. So like we saw with the C4 review, only 24 examples in the peer-reviewed literature. Obviously that needs to be strengthened so we get a better understanding of whether these are effective or not. So emerging challenges and next steps. So yeah, as landscape approaches are increasingly appropriated by commercial or other top-down entities, could they inadvertently further marginalize those who they're initially designed to support? So I think this is a really important question. And I think, the CGIAR even needs to consider to what extent they are incorporating marginalized stakeholders or what extent they're perceived to be just another top-down organization that's kind of imposing this on a landscape or an area, because I know that is how the CG and the CG centres are perceived by some people. There's no escaping that fact, and I think we need to be aware of it. We need to ensure that if we are operationalising these approaches, they are combining those bottom-up and top-down characteristics. And then we need to better understand under what conditions the approach is workable or not. we need to understand what constitutes success and who's benefiting. So again, these are all sort of interrelated and relate to the performance of the landscape approach. We need to learn from past initiatives and avoid repeating mistakes. So there's so much work that's been done prior to integrated landscape approaches, and some of that stuff is really useful, and there have been some, you know, good components that have been really successful, and we need to incorporate within these kind of new iterations of landscape approaches. There's still question marks over how to ensure long-term sustainability, and I think, you know, how to institutionalize these processes is an important question going forward. I think I've said already, good evidence of implementation, weak evidence of effectiveness. However, there is widespread implementation now, and we need to also consider the final point, you know, to what point are there institutional overlaps, and you know, where is the knowledge sharing happening? So I know in certain countries there's a number of initiatives happening at the same time in overlapping areas. We need to make sure that they're better coordinated and feed into perhaps regional initiatives as well, where knowledge can be shared and lessons can be learned. And that's it. Sorry, I don't know if it was a bit long or rambling, but hopefully that gave an introduction to how at least we're perceiving landscape approaches. And if anybody's got any questions, happy to answer. And if anybody wants further information, please send us an email, and happy to also link to other literature and some of the work cited as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.